Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is Art Van Walde, and I am your host for this episode. And today we have with us Tim Reddy, who is director of the Lewis Walker Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnic Relations at Western Michigan University. Tim, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Okay, it's good to have you here with us. Tell us a bit about yourself, Tim, so the audience can know who you are.
Well, I'm a native of Michigan. I've spent most of my professional life living in Washington, D.C. I'm a sociologist. I have worked in academia and in policy circles on a variety of issues having to do with diversity and economic justice issues.
Okay, thank you. Tim, recently I read an article that was forwarded to me in MLive,
Yeah.
and it had some interesting statistics in there that I have heard many times, but
Right.
I think it's important for us to understand what is going on in our society as it comes to incarceration. And one of the statistics that blew me out of the water was in 1970,
Yeah.
we had about 200,000 people who were incarcerated in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Today we have 2.3 million. So 1 in every 100 adults is incarcerated.
Yep.
And could you give us a brief history? What's transpired that this has occurred?
Well, this is primarily the effect of public policy. We did not all of a sudden lose our bearings and have a excess of deviance, but this was a change of policy having to do with incarceration. And so in the 1980s, laws were changed, establishing mandatory minimum sentences, and really making very severe penalties for drug crimes and other offenses, and this led to a dramatic ramp up of people who are incarcerated. And of course, this does not fall, when you mention 1 out of 100 adults, that sounds bad, but when you look at specific populations, it's not just bad, it's catastrophic.
Yes. Okay. And what's interesting to me is we're entering another election cycle. If
Right.
anyone listens to any kind of talk radio, all you hear about is the next presidential election.
Right.
And what tends to happen with politicians as they talk about the criminal justice system? What do they tend to do, Tim?
Well, historically, they have tended to play up fear. I would say there's a lot of fear-mongering, and as a way of ginning up votes. Let's protect ourselves from the threat, whatever they perceive that to be. But I think that's changing because I think that the public is seeing, and politicians are actually seeing it, and we see coalitions of progressive politicians with conservative politicians who are saying this doesn't make any sense to incarcerate so many people. We're wasting our resources, so it's an incredible economic drain on the taxpayers. And by the way, Michigan is one of only 8 states in the country that spends more money on its prison system than it does on higher education. Makes no sense. So people recognize that this doesn't make sense. So the question becomes, so how do we fix it? And one way to fix it is just to say, okay, well, let's spend less money on the prisons. But I think that we have to look at the deeper causes. We have to look at, there have been a whole lot of folks who have been incarcerated, they've had their rights taken away. They have had great difficulty finding employment because of their felony records. So there's a lot of needs out there. And then on the front end, there's just still a whole lot of young people who do not have equality of opportunity when it comes to education, when it comes to growing up poor and kind of isolated from opportunities. And there is still too much too much danger out there that they're going to kind of get swept up in behavior that's going to lead on a pathway to prison rather than a pathway to success, college, or through the trades or whatever.
You brought up something earlier. You said it's catastrophic for certain populations.
Right.
Let's briefly talk about maybe some of those populations that this high incarceration rate is catastrophic for. The African American population, the Latino population. What do you see going on there with this incarceration rate?
First of all, it is very specifically concentrated in low-income African American and to a lesser extent Latino populations, but low-income and people with very, very low levels of education. Something like half of the folks who are incarcerated, the men who are incarcerated, have not completed high school. That's a pretty small segment of the population, but when that's half of all the folks who are incarcerated, that tells you something that there's something seriously wrong here. So when you go back to that figure of 1 out of 100 adults, when you look at that sliver of the population, African American and Latino men with relatively little education, it's a huge percentage of that population. And they've been cut off from opportunities, and they've ended up with being involved in the criminal justice system. And preventatively, steps have to be taken to address that. And certainly, a lot of damage has been done, and we have to see how can we help these men get back into their communities, working and being productive and being an asset to their communities. Yeah.
We now have heard the problem. It's a problem that's been before us.
Yep.
But what are some of the solutions? How do we start to get after this issue of such a high incarceration rate? How do we start to solve this problem in our communities?
I think that one useful way to think about it is to think about it as the folks who are specialists in public health talk about primary prevention and secondary prevention. Secondary prevention, when it comes to illness or disease, for example, is that if you have a infection, you may need an antibiotic. You need to treat the problem that already exists. All right, so when it comes to folks being involved in the criminal justice system and being incarcerated, starting with our sentencing laws, starting with parole. I mean, there's just so many things in the way that the criminal justice system works that need to be addressed. Another factor that is involved in this that has been well documented through many studies that were summarized, among other places, in a authoritative report by the National Academy of Sciences, The Rise of Mass Incarceration in the United States, that was published in 2014. There's bias in the criminal justice system that exists, and it kind of reflects bias that people have when it comes to relations with African Americans and low-income people. Oftentimes, perhaps more often than not, it is unconscious, and people make judgments that they don't even know they're making judgments on that end up being prejudicial to the interests of folks. And so we're hearing a lot about this in recent months, having to do with policing. The Cleveland case with that boy being killed in an instant by the officer who came up and he had a toy gun.
Yes.
There's just lots of things that kind of reflect behaviors that probably are a lot less likely to happen if the suspect, so to speak, in whatever behavior was going on happened to be middle class and white. It probably just wouldn't. It would be far less likely to happen. So there's a lot of attention to policing. The Kalamazoo Police Department, under the leadership of Chief Jeff Hadley, has been very proactive in addressing these issues.
Okay.
And other police departments have been as well. But it doesn't stop with policing. It happens also in what happens with prosecution, what happens in the parole system, it goes throughout the system. So there's unconscious things going on, and then there are specific policy changes that have to happen. One of those policy changes that I found particularly troubling, and because this is an area that I've only gotten into in the last year or so, is that how folks who are on parole, get many charges, and I don't mean judicial charges, I mean financial charges for monitoring devices, for all kinds of things. And these men get trapped in a cycle of debt that have to do with their experiences with the criminal justice system that ends up almost being a debtor's prison kind of a situation. And it's just dumb policy. I mean, it has catastrophic consequences for the people involved, and it's, I want to say the men involved are obviously women, but it's predominantly men. It's self-defeating if the purpose is to get these folks back into society and functioning well and et cetera. It just doesn't work.
Okay. Tim, I'm thinking as you're speaking about our audience,
Yep.
and I know they're hearing about the policing
Right.
and the judicial system, but how can they change the way they think about the situation? How can they change their thoughts, their actions as they see what is going on? Let me give an example. With all the situations that have happened in the United States recently, on Facebook, one of my friends posted something pretty scathing about one of the situations. And I responded back to that person in a private message, well, easy for you to say, you're an upper class white person. Have you ever thought of this from their perspective? And I wonder, can you speak to that?
Well, I think that you've really landed on something there, Art. I think that we're, as a society, we're moving in separate directions by race and by class, by those two things together. And we live in different places. In some ways, at least by class, we are becoming more segregated than we were before. Maybe the racial segregation, we're still incredibly segregated by race. That may be getting slightly better, but from a horrible, tremendous amount of segregation to start with. So we live in different places, we listen to different media, we read different things, but we need to understand that we are one community, okay? And you can understand it, from a secular perspective, from a civic point of view, that it is in everybody's enlightened self-interest to make our communities work. You can obviously take it from a theological perspective.
Yes.
There's plenty of grounding, in the Gospels and in other religious traditions as well, that we need to be our brother's keeper. We need to treat each other as brothers and sisters. And one of the things that we do at our institute, the Walker Institute, is that the basic philosophy is that we call it the one community model, that we need to consider ourselves as one community, whether it's Kalamazoo or Grand Rapids or the state of Michigan, but we also need to be very aware of how there really is not equality of opportunity, particularly when you look at it from the point of view of kids. And it's just clear as day when you look at data, you look at almost any kind of evidence that where you grow up and what your circumstances in which you were raised has a tremendous bearing on your life chances. And we need to fix it.
Yes.
We need to fix it if we're going to really say that we do believe in equality of opportunity as one of the bedrock values of our American democracy. Then we need to do something different. We need to become aware. And getting back to your specific question, what can people do about it? I think one of the things is to, and I guess I'll say my first inclination as an academic is to read about it and learn about it. I think as a citizen, we need to also get involved. Get involved in whether it's through our churches and sort of getting beyond our oftentimes relatively homogeneous and segregated congregations, get involved in mentoring and tutoring, get involved in understanding it and working with people who are different from yourselves. And because people who look like you and me,
they're going to think like you and me.
Yeah, they're going to think like you and me. And what I was going to say is that at least people from my ethnic background, European Americans, we're demographically speaking kind of fading into a less prominent position. And we have to understand that this is a more complex and more diverse society that is emerging inevitably today and in the years and decades to come. And we need to be aware of that and sort of understand that there are other people who have other opinions and other values, maybe some of the same values. I would say that the basic values are the same, but the perspectives on those values maybe reflect different life experiences, and we need to understand them.
Okay. Tim, we're going to dig a bit more into this, but we need to take a break. So we're going to take a break now, and we'll be back in a few moments with Tim Reddy.
Stay connected to what's happening at Crossroad Bible Institute with Crossroad Network News. This free magazine is designed to keep you informed and inspired about what Christ Church is doing in prisons and jails. If you'd like a free subscription to Crossroad Network News, fill out the form online by visiting us at cbi.fm.
Welcome back to this episode of Crossroad Connection, and today we are speaking with Tim Reddy. He is the director of the Lewis Walker Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnic Relations at Western Michigan University. And Tim, recently your organization sponsored a forum, Race Class in the Criminal Justice System. And can you talk briefly about what transpired in that series and subjects that were talked about, and what did people learn?
First of all, we had, I think, 4 or 5 forums, and at each of the forums we had 120, 150 folks in attendance, and we were the audience was what we wanted. We wanted a mix of people who were in positions of power and authority, from the county prosecutor, the police chief, and certain judges. And we had grassroots community people, we had African Americans, we had church people of all backgrounds, so very diverse. The first event had to do with police community relations, particularly with African Americans, very much in the news. Then the second event was a talk by a high-profile speaker. We brought in James Foreman Jr., who is a law professor at Yale University. He's also the son of the civil rights leader by the same name. And he gave a terrific talk from fear and vengeance to mercy and forgiveness. And I thought he really hit just exactly the right tone.
What did he speak about from fear and vengeance? What did he speak about?
Because he was talking about during the 80s, when those laws changed and the sentencing practices happened, there was also at that time a rise in crime, not commensurate with the rise of imprisonment, but yes, there was a rise in crime during the 70s and 80s, and people were fearful and they wanted vengeance, and that's what drove the change in these laws. And I think that some politicians kind of went over the top and for their own political gain in pushing this. But he mentioned, his point was that we have to get beyond that, and that folks who get caught up in the system, we need to think about them as our brothers and our sisters and our children, because that's really who they are. If you think holistically and you think about that we are one people and we want to consider ourselves that way, we can't just go and say, those people, they've got a problem. We have to say, we're not those people and our people, we are people. And we have to say, how can we live together more effectively and more justly as one community. And that was essentially his message. He got into particular reforms in the criminal justice system that need to be made, but underneath that really was this attitudinal change that needs to happen.
In the theological realm, there's a word called sanctification. And what that word means is that we're all growing when we are believers to be more and more like our Savior. And don't we want to walk alongside of people, first of all, introducing them to Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, but having them grow and learn and change? And you don't do that by locking them up and throwing away the key.
Those two things are really contradictory, and that has to, I think, to be logically consistent. And I guess in it from a faith perspective,
Yes.
You can't do that.
Okay.
You just can't do that.
In that forum, you also had something about juvenile justice. What was spoken about there?
We looked at issues of how to prevent kids from getting involved in the juvenile justice system, and then what happens once they get in. Once they get in, it's kind of simpler to talk about things once they get in. There's a whole lot of inequality of opportunity that leads kids from disadvantaged backgrounds to be more likely to get caught up. So that's one thing. But once they're in, there's some things that I think really are calling out for change in a big way. Michigan is one of just a handful of states that automatically treats 17-year-olds as adults. And the great majority of states don't do that. And so, you're not, you can't vote. You're not considered, an adult for any other purpose. But for purposes of criminal justice, if you're 17, you are tried as an adult. We detain a lot of kids in juvenile homes, and we need to find ways to have more community-based diversion programs where we have effective community-based programs where kids can get involved doing good stuff, so to speak. And the other thing that we discussed in the Juvenile Justice Forum was that Michigan, unlike a lot of states, ends up re-incarcerating, or not, incarceration is not the right word, detaining in juvenile homes kids who violate the terms of their probation.
Okay.
So they get out and they haven't committed a crime, but let's say they are disrespectful to their parents, or they they get kicked out of school for some reason, but no crime, but something that gets them in trouble, but would otherwise not be a violation of the law. Well, this because they're already on probation, that lands them back in detention facilities. Again, most other states don't do that. We do. And so we need to have more humanistic ways of treating kids once they get into the system, but more fundamentally, we need to keep them out. And one of the issues related to that, I think, has to do with discipline policies in schools. Suspending and expelling, but certainly suspending kids really doesn't serve much purpose if the kids can't go to school, so they're going to be out on the street without supervision. If they're going to be suspended, there needs to be some alternative programming that was going to be helpful to them. Too often that doesn't exist. But more fundamentally, again, there are just so many kids who are living in families and in communities who are disadvantaged. And again, the families, there's a lot of kids who end up in the system who are in somewhat dysfunctional families. And of course, dysfunctional families can be rich or poor, but being poor kind of tips the odds that it's going to be more likely. Again, most poor families that are economically poor are not dysfunctional. I want to make that super clear. Yes. But again, there are way more challenges facing those families, stresses, et cetera, that increase the likelihood or increase the danger that kids are going to be exposed to a lot of dysfunctional things And that really calls out for some very fundamental changes.
You talked with me briefly about something that's going on in Kalamazoo. It's called Share Prosperity in Kalamazoo. Can you talk briefly about what the Share Prosperity in Kalamazoo is?
This started out as a resolution passed by the Kalamazoo City Commission in February of 2014 to address poverty, particularly among kids. The mayor and Commissioner Don Cooney and a number of other people and I have been involved in conversations about how to implement this, and we came to the conclusion that it's much better to focus on what people aspire to, which is shared prosperity. You know, our region of the state, you know, has a lot of wealth, a lot of prosperity, and there's a lot of good life here, but there are a whole lot of folks who are cut off from those opportunities, particularly kids. So we tend to focus on education as the solution to all problems. It is part of the solution, but there are three things we're focusing on. One is that we need to expand the number of adults who have access to well-paying jobs. Okay. One aspect of that is there's a whole lot of folks who are unemployed or grossly underemployed who are ex-offenders. And these folks want to work. They are, you know, can be great employees. Oftentimes they're denied the opportunity, and that is terrible for their families and terrible for them and terrible for the economy of the metro area. There's a big need to expand work preparation programs in the skilled trades. So increased access to well-paying jobs, broader, more inclusive youth development programs, and then strong economically secure families. So for families that are working in jobs that don't pay very much, and in Kalamazoo about 2/3 of families that are below the poverty line have somebody who works. If they're working in jobs that pay that little, we need to have support systems that are going to help them. That might help with childcare, because there's oftentimes a catch-22 situation. In other words, just a dilemma: do I go to work for a job that doesn't pay very much, and I can't afford to pay somebody to take care of my child? How do you handle that? We need systems to be able to do that. Similarly with transportation, that's another major issue. So you know, ideally, we believe that there needs to be a much higher living wage paid to people, but short of that, if that isn't going to be in the cards politically for whatever reason in the near term, we need to have in-kind services that are developed through the public sector and probably in collaboration with the nonprofit sector.
Well, Tim, thank you. This has been enjoyable speaking with you. I enjoyed hearing about what you are doing in Kalamazoo and how we can make a difference for those who are struggling, those who don't have a voice, how we can be a voice for them. So thank you for being with us. And for all of you who have been listening to us, thank you for your time, and we look forward to you watching us again.